I'm Gail Hecht. Very happy to be here. I am currently professor of medicine and microbiology immunology at Loyola University of Chicago. Primarily, I am focused on my research right now, which is on atypical enteropathogenic E. coli.
Could you give us a little bit of background of how you got into the medical field and then also how you got into gastroenterology?
Okay. Well, the medical field. Okay, so I'll start by saying that I was a psychology major at University of Missouri. I had no knowledge or interest in science or medicine. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was goal-less, that would be the way to put it. And I started working as a nurse's aide at the Harry S. Truman VA in Columbia, Missouri, because my parents were not of means and I needed to supplement my living habits, I guess, because they gave me a small amount of money to get by. So I worked as a nurse's aide there, starting probably my sophomore year in college. I worked evenings, so I went to school in the day and worked in the evenings until 11. And then I thought, well, all right, I'm making $5,000 a year. That's enough money, and I'm just going to quit college and be a nurse's aide. And my parents and my sister, my older sister, rest in peace, Diane, got wind of that, and she was a go-getter. She graduated from college in 3 years and immediately went to medical school, and she had lots of goals that I didn't have. She got on the phone with me and said, I don't know what is wrong with you. You have 18 months left. You need to at least get your bachelor's degree. That would be ridiculous if you quit. And I'm like, all right. So it wasn't my parents, it was my sister who convinced me to finish college. Finished college, still had no goals, and the people at the VA, the nurses in particular, said, oh, you should go to nursing school. I'm like, oh, okay, sure. But I don't want to go back to college. I had just finished 4 years of college. And they said, well, there's this program at St. Louis University that if you have a bachelor's in something else, and they didn't mention, in parentheses, and all these other prerequisite courses, then you can go there and get a bachelor's in nursing in 2 years. I'm like, okay, all right, sure, I'll apply. So I apply. Maybe I didn't read the fine print, or I did and didn't understand how important these prerequisite courses were, but you were supposed to have all kinds of sciences, physiology, chemistry, microbiology, all these things. I had zero. My only sciences were biology, the general thing that everybody took, and I had to do one other, so I chose astronomy. Those were my two sciences. So I started taking these classes, and somehow they really liked me in microbiology, and they said, oh, you should go to graduate school. And I said, oh, okay, all right, maybe I could do that. But, you know, I learned I don't have the prerequisites, which were chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, all this other stuff. They said, oh, that's okay. You know, you can enroll in the graduate courses and at the same time go back and take these undergraduate courses. I'm like, okay. It's like the Pete Davidson, right? Okay. It's like whatever people were telling me to do. So I did all that. In retrospect, I have no clue how I managed all that coursework. It was ridiculous. And I met my husband during this master's program. Well, he wasn't my husband then, but he is now. So he's like, well, you know, we started dating. He's like, well, I'm going to medical school, and I applied to early decision, and if we're going to get married, you need to take MCATs. I'm like, oh, okay. But I don't have chemistry and organic and physics, which are all on the MCATs. He's like, oh, that's okay. You should just, you know, these are the things you need to know. For physics, you need to know 6 equations, thermodynamics, velocity. I don't remember, there were like 4 other ones. And, you know, chemistry, you've had general chemistry, you've had like 6 weeks of organic, it'll be okay. So I take MCATs, we apply to medical school, Loyola University, which he had gotten in early decision, which means he had to go there. And so I applied there, I got in there, and I also got into University of Missouri. I don't know, the forces were with me somehow. It's a really ridiculous story. Otherwise, I would have done a PhD, because I always liked science. And I did get my master's in microbiology. So that was long-winded. I'm sorry, I told you I talk a lot.
So what about gastroenterology? How
Yeah.
did you get into that?
Yeah, so that's a really cool story because when I applied for residency out of medical school, in my little personal statement, I said I wanted to do rheumatology or nephrology. And I liked rheumatology because of all the interesting zebra-like autoimmune diseases. I just found that really interesting to study, although I hadn't really seen many patients in that category. And I like nephrology because I love the physiology. It's like throughout the tubule, these ions are moving in different directions and different spots, and I'm like, that's really cool. So then you go into medicine, and it's like, oh, rheumatology was more seeing a lot of osteoarthritis, and nephrology was a lot of renal failure and dialysis, and I'm like, that's really boring. Yeah, it's like, But my first rotation at the Minneapolis VA, my attending was Craig McLean, who many people will know. He's, I think, still working at University of Kentucky, a nutrition guy. And the Minneapolis VA had an amazing array of academic gastroenterologists. John Bond, who helped start the national polyp trial, was with Sid Winnower. Mike Levitt, the king of farts, the gas guy, right, is hysterical, is brilliant. Roger Gebhardt, who studied small bowel. I mean, the list went on and on. Oh, Jack Venice and Steve Silva, who I think brought ERCP to the US. I mean, the VA was an amazing place. Bob Nodell, liver guy, the Nodell score for liver. I mean, it was just an amazing home for gastroenterology, and I don't know, I was just smitten with GI. So it's like that was it. The others were out the window, and there's no turning back. It's the best field.
What would you tell somebody thinking about going into GI today?
It's the best field. I mean, I tell people that, and I mean, I say it with a smile, but you know, when for me, I mean, look, everybody has their own personal likes and dislikes, but from my perspective, you know, if you go into medicine, you kind of go down the list of subspecialties, and I could rule out various reasons for all of them. But GI is so amazing. So let's say you're a clinician. You can choose to focus on a certain area, IBD, liver disease, motility. You can focus on the esophagus. You can focus just on the stomach, right? Or the small bowel, or cancer. I mean, epidemiology. You pick whatever you want. That can be your niche, and you can be an expert, you know, in that field. Or if you want to be a general gastroenterologist, look at the many, many diseases and disorders that you're going to be seeing. It's not just the same thing over and over. It's such a rich subspecialty when you compare it to the others in medicine, in my opinion. And the same applies to research. You can pick one area. It can be infectious disease. It can be immunology. It can be cancer biology. It can be neurology. It can be epidemiology, right? It's so vast. It's really fascinating. And, you know, maybe people in other subspecialties see the same, you know, parsing of their field. But then we also have endoscopy, which is brilliant. It's becoming, you know, really surgery if you want to go, you know, the interventional route. So it adds a lot of fun, flavor, and different opportunities to your career.
So what motivated you to get involved with AGA and, you know, join the board and eventually become president?
I wanted to go to a high-level research institution for my fellowship, so I was pretty selective. And I had a master's degree, you know, in science, which gave me a little bit of a foothold, you know, with those kinds of institutions. So I interviewed with Jerry Trier at Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I mean, don't take this the wrong way. I literally fell in love with that man from the first time I met him. What a kind soul. He was a true gentleman. So Jerry just passed away. I think it was late March of this year, 88 years old. So I don't know. We just really hit it off, and he offered me a position a few weeks later, you know, by phone, and I was thrilled to be a part of their program. They had a T32 training grant, which is what I wanted, more focus on research, you know, not so much clinical. So in those days, it was 1 year of clinical, 2 years in the lab. And Jerry was AGA president in 1986, and I was a fellow at the Brigham at the time. So we, all the fellows, the whole GI division was immersed in the culture of AGA, driven by Jerry probably in large part. So anybody who had, we all had to submit abstracts to, well, it was called AGA at the time. AGA, it was not called DDW, it was called AGA because it was AGA's meeting until all the other, societies joined in. So we had these very intense practice sessions where you had to have a script for all of your slides if you had an oral presentation. You had to practice, and then they would edit, and then you would come back and we'd have another practice session. I bet we had 2 or 3 practice sessions before this meeting. Everybody from the Brigham was polished for their presentations. So I'm trying to remember my first year of coming. It must have been 1988 or 89. And I was a fellow, 3rd year, and I had a presentation on C. difficile toxin A and its effects on intestinal epithelial cells. I was working in Jim Madera's lab. And I was selected to give my presentation at the AGA presidential plenary. And this is when there was no competing programming. So if anybody went to anything, it was the presidential plenary. And I think there were probably there were, I don't know, 5,000, 3,000 people in the audience. It was huge. Huge room, 3 big screens. I mean, it was daunting. And I'm not afraid, to be in front of a crowd, but I don't know. And I'm just a freaking fellow, right? And all these guys are out there, mostly guys at the time. And so I got through it. It was fine. It was a great, project. But I have to say that I was nervous about the questions. And one of the first ones, and maybe it was the first one, was by Mark Donowitz, one of AGA's past presidents. And Mark is like a transport guy. He's very intense. And I think he asked me something about potassium channels, which I think, maybe I misheard it. I was so nervous, but it made no sense. I didn't work on potassium channels. It had nothing to do with C. diff, or maybe, I don't even know. I should ask him if he knows what the question was. I'm not even sure how I answered it, or maybe I just said, I don't know. But that was the scariest part. But anyway, that was my introduction to AGA, and I just wanted to be a part of it from even before I attended my first meeting, driven by Jerry, I'm sure, Jerry Trier.
So you were the first female president since Sarah Jordan. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. And you really looked into her history and the history of AGA during your presidency. Can you tell us a little bit about what you learned and share that experience with us?
Yeah, so it's interesting because a lot of people ask that question, and I was always a tomboy growing up, and I loved competing with guys even when I was in grade school. Like I wanted to race them, or like in athletics, I wanted to compete with the guys. So I think I didn't realize that all the past presidents were white males. I don't know. I think I just didn't even see it, and I didn't consider that an obstacle. I was just pretty naive. I'm like, oh, I want to be AGA president. This is what you do. It's like you kind of saw how it worked. And in fact, I was mentioning to someone the other day that when I was I think a first-year faculty at University of Illinois Chicago, the department chairman wanted to meet, individually with each new faculty member. And he said, well, Gail, what are your goals? I said, well, I want to start my own lab. I want to have independent funding, and do some meaningful research. I really wanted that more than the clinical side. And I want to be AGA president. And he's like, well, that's not a goal. I'm like, well, for me it's a goal. But, because it was, I don't know, I just loved the society so much from the beginning. I just wanted to be a part of it, it just feels good. So anyway, it came true, and I didn't take into account obstacles, or I didn't see the obstacles. But I remember Dan Podolsky at one meeting, I can see the convention center, but I can't remember the city. I guess the guys would talk behind their backs about who should get nominated or some kind of thing. But Dan Podolsky came up to me at that meeting and he said, you know, you should consider like running for governing board. And I'm like, oh, really? I don't know, I was kind of surprised in a way, but I'll tell one more piece to the story. It's just, a lot of it's luck, you know, where you are, the circumstances. I think being a woman for me it was discrimination, but it was positive discrimination because in those years, all the committees, I guess the board too, was looking to add more women. I think they were realizing, you know, this is a pretty stagnant, you know, like profile of the leaders and we need to change that up. So I think I was a benefactor of that. And the AGA had it was some kind of an educational program. I can't remember what it was called, but it was when H. pylori was hitting the scene and there's something about colon cancer and hepatitis C. Those were the new topics. And our mission was to go into these smaller communities and give like CME educational talks on certain topics. And I think because I was female primarily, and I wasn't an H. pylori person, but I studied bacteria, so I think I fit 2 out of the 3 criteria. They asked if I would be part of the H. pylori programming, and you'd get on these little planes and fly to these little places and, you know, have these evening sessions with some of the folks. Well, I met Jim Freston at one of these, and he said, oh, Gail, blah, 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 are you serving on any AGA committees? And I said, no. He said, would you be interested in that? I said, yeah, of course I would be. He said, well, Tachi Amada is going to be the next president. I'll talk to him. And whatever happened, it doesn't work this way now. Okay, so it's for the better. I was asked to be on, I think it was the research committee probably first, because I served also on the education committee subsequently. So it was just, I don't know, it was just luck, and I really wanted that, and I made myself visible and available.
And so eventually you serve on the board and become president.
Right.
And
so I did the whole gamut, you know, on council. I was chair of intestinal disorders. I was the basic science counselor to the governing board, and then applied to be president, and that was that. So it was awesome. And no one ever talked about the past presidents much, except maybe the ones who had made major discoveries, you know, throughout the history of GI. But people would say to me, oh, a lot of people would say you're the first woman president. And I kind of looked, other people would say the second. And I'm like, well, what is it, right? So I actually had to look into that because no one talked about Sarah Jordan. So she was actually the first AGA president during World War II. She served 2 terms. They say because there weren't enough guys around. I don't know if it's true. I think it's because she was magnificent. There weren't enough guys who were as good as she was. I don't know. But so I wanted to do for my presidential plenary a highlight of her personally and what the field of GI looked like at that point in time. And I probably spent, you know, you've got like a year to prep for that. I probably spent a good 8 or 9 months pulling pictures, old pictures from history, understanding how they discovered celiac disease, you know, for example, and the mechanism, and, you know, like what drove diarrhea from cholera. I mean, there were so many major discoveries in that era, and I wanted people to know that and to know about her. So I should have reviewed her history, but she was from Germany, I think, but she went to, was it Wesley? Anyway, I won't say it, you have to read it, but she went to a very well-known college, and she wanted to go into medicine, and her father said no, because women don't become doctors. So she got a PhD in some really difficult topic and translated some like very amazing work. She was just phenomenal, and she went to Germany, I think, to do her PhD and met her husband. And I think it was then that World War II broke out. And he was German, so he had to stay with the German army. And her parents are like, you need to come back to America. And they had a child at that time. So she brought her daughter back to the US. Her husband stayed in Germany. And she was a single mom, back in, well, it would have been in the 30s, so it must have been World War I. Yes, World War I, sorry, is when she was in school. So anyway, she came back, lived with her parents. And she decided to go to medical school against her father's wishes. And she had a baby. So it was just phenomenal. I mean, and I could spend the whole time talking about her history, but she was just a very brave woman and worked so hard. She did research, she published, she was very witty. There are a lot of quotes, from her that are very funny. If someone wanted to look up, I think the presidential addresses are published, and I review, her history. She wrote a book called Good Food for Bad Stomachs, and that was published. She served on, I think she was on one of the Boston City Council boards or some kind. I mean, she was just prominent in the Boston community. Anyway, sorry for rambling, but she was fantastic and is not given enough time. So to follow in her footsteps was pretty daunting because there's really no filling her shoes by a man or a woman.
So where do you think, what are your thoughts about where AGA is today?
I think, I still love AGA, and it's funny because I've been involved with the organization for so long, and some of the problems and issues that we struggled with X number of years ago, we're still struggling with today, but maybe in a little bit different light. I think AGA is in a good place. They're always trying to figure out how to stay ahead, of the curve, which is difficult. And, and I think all the members find it difficult because it's such a big organization. So it can be hard, to move quickly. Dan Podolsky always used the word nimble. We need to be nimble, but it's so difficult for an organization of, 15, 16, 17,000 members to be nimble, and you're serving so many different factions of the field. But we are, I think, trying to stay ahead of the curve, and in my opinion, I know there are many GI organizations in the country. I have always considered AGA the premier organization, and why do I say that? It's not disparaging any of the others, but AGA was founded on focusing on research, basic research, and mechanisms. And that resonates, of course, with me. But they've now, over time, embraced, even probably more than research, clinical care, because that's so important today to all of us as people, as doctors, as leaders of organizations. It's important, to stay up on the clinical side, but we also need to forward treatments by doing basic science research. So for me, this meeting, and AGA in particular, is the only organization that tries to marry those two. I mean, we have PhDs coming to this meeting, a lot of them presenting their basic science research. I don't think you find that or much of that at the other GI meetings. And so it just is the perfect GI organization for me, and I hope for many others.
What is your hope for AGA's future?
That it continues on this road, and I hope that we can show clinicians that AGA, cares as much about healthcare, clinical, work as we did about research. I think that old reputation of being formed on a research base is hard to convince people. I mean, reputations are hard to change. Even though you're doing the work, it's sometimes, blinders get put on. But I'm hoping that the whole community of GI, clinical and research, realizes that we are really a breadbasket for all of those. So, and I hope that we can find a way to embrace and pull in more GI trainees, the younger folks, because, we all get old like me and have to move over and make room for the new people. And I became just such a strong believer, in AGA as a fellow. And I think it happens as a fellow. And I think we really need to find a way to show people, fellows, at their young stage in gastroenterology, that all the benefits that this organization brings.
Is there anything you'd like to share that I didn't ask you about?
Yes, that's a great question. But the first thing that came into my mind, honestly, is the AGA staff. So, people don't see the AGA staff. They might hear about the president or the governing board or the council and the programming, or maybe not even that, the behind the scenes. But the behind the scenes is the staff. And that made, I don't know, it makes the organization run. It couldn't be done without the staff. And I don't know how many there are now, but it's a big staff, and that's how, like as a president or anyone on the board, can effectuate these ideas that come forward, because there are people behind the scenes actually doing it. It was probably my first experience of having the ability to have an idea and express an idea and have it come to fruition, right? Because if you're a division director, everybody has good ideas, but maybe you don't have the funding or not enough people to do the work. It was amazing to me. And I would want to make sure I say, for me, well, all the camaraderie within AGA, with the staff, with all the physicians or other members, that I've met all over the world, not only here, the friends, lifelong friends. My time with AGA, I can sum up in, I guess, a hyphenated term: life enhancing.
Wow. Thank you for talking to me today.
It's my pleasure.